Typically with these kinds of videos, I like to begin with some sort of softball introduction about what a series is, what the first game was, where the idea from the first game came from, or what series it was inspired by and how successful it became before talking about the new game. Unfortunately, I realize that approach is really fucking boring. As fun as it'd be to drag this video out by mentioning what happened from Resident Evil 1 through 6, it's desperately not needed considering how popular the series already is. I mean, even beyond the recent spark of interest with the newer games, they've been Capcom's cornerstone franchise with games like Street Fighter and Devil May Cry. With spin-offs and terrible movies and shows, there's a lot of RE content in general. Even those bad products still manage to make a profit, and they somehow still have their fans. Now, the thing that can't really be denied about old RE is that in the late 2000s and early 2010s, it had a bit of an identity crisis. You see, it kind of all started with Resident Evil 4, deciding more so to abandon the slow-paced survival horror structure for a more fast-paced, insane action game. At the time, it was frankly not that bad of a thing, since the game was great and all, and the Resident Evil 4 remake is probably one of the best games of all time along with the original. Besides the literal first Mario Bros. Games on the NES, RE4 is probably the most influential game ever made. Without this, not only would you not have any future RE games the way they are now, for better or worse, but also every third-person action game in general would simply not be the same. You wouldn't have your Gears of War or your Uncharted or your Vanquish or whatever the hell else without Resident Evil 4, and its revolutionary step forward for action games. The main problem with this is that it obviously had some impact on Capcom's decision making when it came to the series direction. People really liked the action in RE4, and it made a lot of money at the time. So Capcom assumed that's what the people wanted, so they gave us, well, that stuff. You have to understand that Capcom was literally able to get away with anything at this time. Like rewriting Leon Kennedy from being a nervous rookie cop to an action hero who spouts cheesy one-liners. So they probably felt like Homelander at the end of Season 3 of The Boys. Sadly, this thinking had backfired. RE5 was good for what it was, but it had terrible bosses and a laughably tacked-on co-op mode, and while it was fun, the tank controls from RE4 didn't really make much sense at this point, considering that most shooters at the time still allowed you to move while shooting. And then RE6 was a bit of an overhated game in my opinion, but it's still not very good. And while it fixed 5's tank controls, the mission structure and constant back-to-back set pieces were a headache to get through. Plus, you had to play the game 4 times to complete every campaign, which made it even more tedious. Multiple campaigns were a thing before, but it was limited to 2 characters instead of having to take almost 30 hours. With 8. RE6 was critically panned enough to drive Capcom back to the drawing board despite selling well. And with that, they took a few years off the series and came back in 2017 with Resident Evil 7, which had a new protagonist, a new perspective, a fresh comeback for the survival horror aspects of Resident Evil, among other things. Although the horror doesn't really feel the same as in those older games as much as it does something like Amnesia or the canceled game PT. I thought it was a pretty good game that just kinda goes to shit past the sludge jack fight, but it's still a fun time. Either way, it reinvigorated the series, both critically and financially speaking. More so critically, as it restored faith in the series after a barrage of fairly under-delivering games. It also helped introduce new fans to the series, and even got the action RE fans more accustomed to the horror parts of Resident Evil. Village totally changes all of this and goes back to being mostly action from start to finish though. I like Village quite a bit, and it is very fun to play, from combat with normal enemies to boss fights and set pieces. However, it feels like it knocks out what I liked most about 7, which was the horror and the atmosphere. Yes, there are stalkers in this game, and some horror elements, but most of the game is a lot like 4, and while I love 4, I didn't think it worked as well here, and unlike Leon, Ethan Winters isn't really good enough as a protagonist to me, so it sort of falls flat. However, between 2017 and 2023, we also got the Resident Evil 2 remake, which was pretty good, even if it somewhat dumbed down the A and B scenarios compared to the original 2, but it was still fun. Then we got 3 remake, which was obviously very rushed, which is kind of funny considering how original 3 was a side game for 2 that was also rushed, and now exists as an even smaller side game than that one, which was already just okay. 4's remake is probably the best game in the series, but that's just my opinion. From what you can tell, all these games are very different. Like, very, very different from one another. They often alternate between action and horror for each entry, which while I like both, I could see that being alienating to some people who like one over the other. However, what if we not only had 2 playable characters, or had them assigned to separate campaigns like the rest of the series, but those versions were also split between action and horror Resident Evil gameplay. Not only that, but if we could allow for both to be in the game without one being favored. That's where Requiem comes in, and not only is it a good game, but it mostly masters the art of the dual campaign. Also, no, I won't be talking about the story because I have very little to say about it. There's hype and aura, and Grace is the best character, and Leon is cool, and Zeno sucks. Alright, that's it, goodbye! Now, obviously, you might be asking yourself, you're not. What the hell is a dual campaign? Well, a dual campaign is exactly what it sounds like. A campaign where you play as two characters. Think of any game with a campaign where you often have to switch between two different characters for them to do very specific missions with said character. Even if the game has more than two playable characters, it can still be a dual campaign if the ones you play the most are the two main characters. It's not an official term, but this is what I'll be calling any single player game with these types of campaigns. Many games to some degree have a dual campaign, even in smaller ways. Devil May Cry 4 is one of the more hardline examples of a dual campaign, as you have to play as only Dante and Nero in the base game, even though Special Edition makes you play as 3 other characters. Insomniac Spider-Man 2 is a looser case, as despite it allowing you to play as Mary Jane and even Venom in one mission, it abides by the rule of 2 main characters being predominantly playable, that being Peter Parker and Miles Morales. Resident Evil very much had multiple playable characters in a single story mode. Resident Evil 1, both remake and original, have different campaigns to play. Both versions of RE2 had the Leon and Claire campaigns, 5 had the co-op campaign, and 6 had 4 different co-op campaigns. However, there was a common pattern with a lot of these games' implementation of other playable characters. Whenever Resident Evil had more than one character to play as, it usually went one of 2 ways. 1, despite there being obviously a better character, they basically played the exact same because they're both horror or both action. The other thing is that usually when it's a short segment, they'll either completely break the flow of gameplay, or they'll be essentially what's an easy mode for the game for one mission. Now, while these aren't inherent flaws on their own, I do get why this could be perceived as annoying or weird. It's either stagnating or it completely ruins the flow of the game. In Resident Evil 2, both in remake and the original, there are obvious differences between Claire Redfield and Leon Kennedy. Claire is obviously the better character to play as in RE2 remake specifically, she has better weapons, moves generally a lot faster than Leon, and honestly, the pacing of the campaign is a lot better anyway. You don't switch between the two in one campaign, but this is a game where there are obviously multiple playable characters. RE5 and 6 also tried having co-op campaigns, but this was poorly implemented, both for different reasons. 5, you can very much tell it was something that they put in because so many action shooters at the time had that, especially third-person shooters. It also doesn't help that the game is fairly miserable to get through alone at times, considering a lot of its balance is kind of predicated on being co-op, which is part of what makes the bosses terrible. For 6 is a case where it actually feels a bit more balanced around both co-op and solo play. However, it also is a very cluttered game in general compared to 5 all around. If you're playing in co-op, you have to play as both of these characters in this one really messy campaign. Not to mention said campaign, while not as horrible as a lot of RE fans make it out to be, is a giant slog to get through. Requiem does something different by not only giving you 2 diametrically opposed playstyles, but balancing them. Rather than giving 2 campaigns to give off the illusion of proper pacing, or forcing in one character after a long time playing another, they split the time quite evenly throughout the game. Usually this would be done by, again, giving them separate campaigns, or by literally giving one half the game and the other gets the other half the game. But that would have been awful. So how does this play in Requiem's favor? Well, let's find out. As touched on earlier, I think a lot of people think of balancing 2 major characters in the most literal of literal senses, from what I usually see online. Usually when there's a game that comes out with 2 playable protagonists and underdelivers on balancing the 2, I see a common reductive fix. The fix being to give them both halves of the game individually, and then it'll achieve some sort of pacing equilibrium. But that just doesn't work, because it's not very realistic. What Resident Evil Requiem does is achieve gameplay equity rather than gameplay equality, because there is a difference. Grace's segments are front-loaded within the first half of the game, while Leon takes most of the second half, sure, but that's not on her or Leon taking up half the game. Grace is a new character, and one with a horror approach to gameplay. In this part of the game, her segments are fairly lengthy. This isn't a bad thing, however, as the approach with survival horror gameplay is amazing, as I'll explain later. Then you have Leon's segment, and the way it's integrated into the campaign is stellar in my opinion. They don't have too much of him or too little throughout the story. He's in the first half for short bursts, but not bursts so short that they feel like nothing sequences, but he's also not in the game for too long either. If Leon took as much time as Grace did in that first half, this game would be worse and way more bloated. Not only would it be bloated, but it'd also forget what makes this game as good as it is now. What I like about the dual campaign is how it nails something simple that even the director described: tension and relief. Part of having different characters played in the same game is to at least feel something different, not to the point of being the absolute antithesis of what the game is going for. More so, that it varies the gameplay enough to keep the game from becoming stale, especially in a case like this, where traversal and combat aren't exactly complex enough for there to not be this many shakeups. I think a lot lot of Resident Evil games that don't have too many moments of switching between characters tend to have worse pacing. This happens more so with action RE than horror RE, but it's still annoying. The reason why RE5 and RE6 are as divisive as they are isn't because of the fact that there's too much action all the way through. It's more so because it completely cancels out any horror or slower pacing, and the action itself is almost too non-stop, especially in 6 where it is a drag, with nothing to break it up at all. What makes this balance so good with the case of RE9 isn't just difference for the sake of being different in the moment, however. It's allowing the game to have the right amount of both. The care center segment is more focused on the horror and the atmosphere and how scared Grace is. You get a taste of how Leon will play, but just enough to feel satiated in the moment, and not so much to the point of feeling overstuffed. Then the second half is Leon most of the way through with the Raccoon City and Umbrella Lab stuff that doesn't go on for too long, considering this game's relatively short 9 to 10 hour length on a first playthrough. I think that whole pacing thing actually does work with how long the game is. Again, it's not just putting Leon in the second half and Grace in the first, with even sprinkles of one or the other. It's the fact that it takes advantage of its short length by giving these characters a certain amount of time. Enough about this part though, as I think we should speak on the actual gameplay now. As stated before, the game is split into two completely different gameplay styles, horror and action. I explained how they're wonderfully paced compared to other RE games. You either try both and fail, or try to do one thing and also still fall short. However, I never really explained how both of them really are. So how are they? I think they're both great. Grace's segments are probably some of the best horror RE gameplay, especially in recent years. I didn't play in first person my first playthrough, honestly, because I personally prefer to play in third, but I probably should have. It's a very immersive horror experience, both in first and third person. Also, skin anybody who plays Leon in first person, because what the fuck? Having to solve puzzles and figure out how to escape the care center reminded me of the best parts of RE2 Remake and 7. The infected having more personality than just drooling zombies added to the tension for me. I wasn't exactly shitting my pants scared or anything, but these segments are carried by how tense they can be and how ordinary you truly are. One may say they did this before with Ethan in 7, but I disagree, because while Ethan in RE7 was kind of this, he also had his moments of being an action badass, way more akin to Leon or Chris. He was a lot more like Ash Williams in Evil Dead 2 than like a normal person. That twist in 8 that he was actually one of the molded after the beginning of 7 made that make a lot more sense. RE7 and 8 are good games, and I'm not denying that I enjoyed them at all. However, even for 7, I don't think that it quite made Ethan feel as powerless yet cognitively capable as Grace would be in Requiem. Even in 7, which was more horror than action, he had these moments where he was more action hero-like. Sure, he wasn't punching boulders or doing unnecessary backflips or anything, but Grace wouldn't do even half the shit Ethan does in 7. He literally was able to have that whole garage sequence and had a chainsaw duel with Jack and beat him. After that, he literally fought him again when he became a giant gunk monster head on. Granted, that form of Jack had these pimple popper weaknesses that the series is known for, but he still beats Jack before he comes back in the DLC for some reason. Grace's encounters with the infected are a lot more grounded in comparison. She can narrowly escape in ways that likely would be ridiculous if it were a real scenario, but the scare factor is the most integral part of Grace's gameplay. This doesn't mean that you're playing as a weak and incompetent imbecile throughout the whole game either. You're playing as a relatively realistic and commonsensically smart person who uses her brain and common sense to scrape by everything. And she'll even use her gun if she has to, even if it's not the most effective all the time. Grace has weapons, and for the most part they're relatively effective, but it takes more effort to find ammo or resources. Granted, you can just use the blood collector to craft resources, but you don't just use blood to craft bullets and whatever the hell else. It also really helps depth-wise that you can only really craft a few resources at a time, even if you have max blood collecting capacity. The hemolytic injector is probably the most powerful crafting item, but it requires 60 drops of blood to make multiple, and requires scrap, which aren't that hard to come by, but it takes effort. I think that this blood crafting system, while making it somewhat easier, isn't exactly an end-all be-all. It still requires some level of scavenging and depth and avoiding enemies to get to all the resources that you need, so therefore the blood collector isn't just easy mode. And as is tradition with Resident Evil, there's a stalker, and this time it's the girl. Now she does get a boss fight later, but for the first part, she is just a stalker, similar to Mr. X or Jack. I think that this one actually does a good job at solving that safe room problem that the series has had for the past few years. See, in the older games, there would be this problem where you would just go to a different room and then the stalker would just disappear before randomly appearing again when you go into the next one. Then when 7 came out, it was a little bit easier to hide the safe room problem, specifically when you'd go into specific rooms that Jack couldn't enter, probably because this game isn't third person, so you can't really just see him look at you and then walk away. But then in RE2 Remake, sometimes you would just go in a room, and then Mr. X would just not go in and just go some other direction. It was very weird. Then this whole problem reaches apex with 8, where Lady Dimitrescu would just kind of see you go into the shop or whatever, and then she just doesn't do anything. As if you weren't there. Thankfully with 9, it solves this issue by having the girl be weak to UV lights. Granted, I wouldn't say it's that logically consistent with what is a UV light, but hey, there's at least somewhat of a remedy to the whole safe room thing. This is then used as a weakness in the boss fight later, so it actually makes sense mechanically. Leon's segments are a lot more action-focused, akin to his appearances in the RE4 original and remake, and his campaign in RE6. I think in terms of sheerly pacing and the types of scenarios they're put in, it's a lot closer to RE4 remake and 6 rather than original RE4. I think at the core mechanically, his combat is a lot better than both, and feels like if 6 had good pacing and more of an actual focus. Mechanically, it feels like a sequel to RE4 remake, which I think is perfectly fine. It just feels fun to parry enemies and do melee finishers. Said melee finishers are expanded upon, as you can finally use your melee weapon to perform them, unlike RE4 remake. And unlike the knives in RE4 remake, the hatchet is more of a permanent item like the knife in the original 4, or in other games between 4 and 8. Unlike 4 through 8, however, the hatchet isn't just an unlimited resource, and it needs to be consistently sharpened after further use. I thought this would be overpowered and break the combat and the flow of the game, but I actually like that you have to manage your positioning a little bit to sharpen it uninterrupted. It creates a lot of tension, and you can sprint while doing it, which makes it less tedious and pace breaking. Just like the knives in 4 remake, you can use them for both melee and parrying. Parrying obviously feels great in both games. I think I like the parrying a little better here because the window is tighter than in 4 remake. That game's parrying was fun, but it wasn't that difficult, so I'm glad that this one makes you pay a little more attention instead of just spamming L1 and hoping for the best. I will say that while the hatchet is cool, it's also weirdly less cool than the knife. I had a lot of fun with it, but the knife was just way more satisfying to use in 4 remake. Maybe it's the practicality of using a big axe over a small effective knife, but I'm not too sure. This part of the game feels like a third-person Doom pacing-wise at least, and that's what I like about it. Leon since 4 has been kind of a power fantasy action hero type, and I think that reaches its logical conclusion with Requiem. I like that he feels stronger than in the other games because of his immense experience and how far he's come since RE2. In RE2, you're basically running for your life at every moment. In 4, there was definitely more of an action hero feel, but he obviously felt scrappy with minimal training. 6 was mostly Michael Bay action shit, although pretty much everyone was this. Requiem just makes him Frank Castle, and that's probably the best thing to do with him at this point. Considering how short his segments were during the first half, it's relieving, as stated earlier. It never feels repetitive or like you're too overpowered. Even in the second half where it's mostly Leon and then Grace getting one segment, it never feels like you get too much of Leon if you play it correctly. His combat doesn't have the level of depth of Grace's horror, but that's okay. As long as attacks hit hard and feel good, that's enough for me. I'll admit that while I like the Raccoon City stuff narratively and even in some cases gameplay wise, exploring the city is somewhat boring, mostly because of how drab and gray everything is, which makes it a lot more bland. I know the place was destroyed and all, but does it really have to look like every Xbox 360 shooter that was set in the afternoon? I've heard some critiques that there's not enough subtle horror in this segment. This mostly has to deal with the fact that Leon isn't even like he was in 4, where he was in an undiscovered place with zombie villagers, which even in an action hero sense is horror. However, I don't think we need that again, because at this point, in the overly long and convoluted narrative of Resident Evil, the atmospheric feeling in that sense wouldn't make sense at all. Leon's been on the job for years, and him still getting shocked or unnerved by the same shit he did when he was like 25 or whatever would be annoying considering everything that he, Chris, Claire, Sherry, and others have been through by now. I think the one part I severely dislike about the second half is that one origin segment where there actually is horror, hilariously enough. Okay, so context. In RE2 Remake, there was a segment where you played as Sherry at the orphanage trying to evade Chief Irons. I'll be honest and say I didn't really love the segment too much, as it felt a bit on rails, but I'll give it that it had a level of tension and wasn't too stop and start, to at least be somewhat engaging along with having decent puzzles here and there. RE9 tries doing a similar segment to that, where you play as the little girl that the villains believe to be Grace as a kid or some type of clone. It's an origin story that acts as somewhat of a callback to RE2, mechanically speaking, as it takes place in the orphanage and you play as a young girl trying to escape. This segment sucks. This is because it has every issue I stated with the RE2 remake segment, but made even worse. First, there aren't even any interesting puzzles, which makes it feel, again, like start and stop. The second problem is a lot more obvious. Trying to hide from these infected kids is part of that hyper-scripted cinematic game problem where every game seems to have that moment that just feels like a slog. This isn't even as much of an issue in other games that are supposed to be cinematic because they're meant to be played and beaten in a specific amount of time, usually about 8 to 15 hours depending on the game, but Resident Evil games are meant to make you speedrun your second playthrough, so the scripted bullshit is just more annoying here. Speaking of things to actually critique here, the bosses. Boss fights in Resident Evil may not seem that important at first, but once you realize how good they can be, they basically become a cornerstone in the player's mind. Admittedly, earlier bosses from games pre-RE4 are very janky for the most part, with a few exceptions. However, the series has mostly improved its bosses as the games have gone on. Usually the best bosses have a mix of environmental depth, positioning, and occasionally some sort of cinematic or narrative significance. As far as Requiem's bosses, I'll only really include major ones and not mini bosses like Singers or the Chainsaw Guys. The first actual boss is Chunk, who's this obese zombie who's hyper fixated on food, since that's what his thoughts were before turning, I guess. I actually kind of like this fight, especially when you play as Leon. I'm very aware you can kill him as Grace, but I didn't have enough hemolytic injectors to actually kill the guy, so there's that. And as Leon, I think the boss is pretty fun. It is a first boss, so it's kind of easy, but that's obviously fine because it'd be dumb if the first boss was that hard. This fight is really focused on goading Chunk into really destructible parts of the environment and shooting him to stun, which is fun. It gets better as the fight goes on too, because it becomes a lot more vertical, even if not for too long, because again, this is a relatively short and easy fight. I also think it's more satisfying to struggle as Grace and then to more or less completely wash him as Leon. Also, Blisterborn is a boss that's very much real. The fight with the girl is the only fight Grace has, which is kind of a shame, but it also makes sense. This fight is more about the environment than shooting her to death, which makes this fight shine. Speaking of shining though, the objective is to get her under a UV light source of any kind, but specifically the large one from the ceiling. All you have to do is memorize certain areas, which I think is a good test of your mind compared to all the other bosses in the game. It's probably the best one, maybe second best? I'm not sure because most of the bosses here are not that amazing. Then there's the spider boss that you fight as Leon that's kind of terrible. It's not the worst fight in the series or anything, but it's just boring. I'll give it that cinematically it's kind of fun to watch here and there, especially when you're trying to escape it. Unfortunately, it's not very interesting, and there's not much of note to say about it. Later in the Raccoon City segment, you get a fight that's probably by definition the worst and best in the entire game. The Mr. X part is scripted, but it's still fun to play through it. I think Mr. X's return was kind of shocking until I remembered that Leon fought Tyrant in the canon animated movies, and it kind of removed that surprise factor. Still fun to see him again though. After that scripted segment in the interiors, you do get to fight him in his super tyrant form outside. I won't lie and say, while I had fun, this was super anticlimactic as a fight. I think the biggest issue for me, besides how easy he is, would be the arena. It's just so boring to look at, and the fight itself, while fun, isn't as engaging as it could be. His moveset is okay, I suppose. I like the fact that he tries to use the environment to his advantage by throwing cars at you. Pairing his charge attacks as Leon feels satisfying after being, well, not able to do that in RE2 as powerless cop Leon. The fight itself is somewhat cathartic as far as Leon's growth is concerned, I guess. Although even that doesn't really make sense since the tyrants are supposed to be more resistant to bullets than this. But I guess it's not that bad, even if it's a little bit distracting. I just find the boss too easy and short as far as a rematch against the final boss of a previous game is concerned. It's fun for what it was, but it felt like you could just sneeze on him and he dies. After the third or fourth axe finisher on the guy, I thought there would be more, but then the cutscene plays and he dies and is never mentioned again. Again, I like the fight, but I just can't love it due to how insanely low the difficulty is and the really bland arena. The fight with Hunk is a lot like Mr. X in this game, where he has all the makings of the best boss in the game, but his fight is still too easy and short. I'll give him that unlike Mr. X, his arena is considerably better here, especially in the second phase when he starts obscuring himself with gas. I think even mechanically this is probably the best fight in the game. However, what keeps him from being my undisputed best is everything surrounding those mechanics. He just sort of shows up randomly as a surprise for fans, I guess. The problem is he only really shows up for this specific fight just to quote-unquote die 3 minutes later anyway. There's little narrative setup or much banter between him and Leon before this fight, so if you're a normie and didn't play Operation Raccoon City or Fourth Survivor in RE2, you're probably gonna be super confused as to why this random soldier guy is even as strong as Leon or talks as if he knows about him. It just feels like those random lightsaber duels against non-Jedi and Jedi Survivor where they're like, yes, I've waited 10 years for this, bro. Like, yeah, if I was a random new player, I think I'd be kind of confused too. The second issue I have with him is as stated earlier. The fight is way too short. This fight very obviously takes a lot of inspiration from the Krauser fight from the RE4 remake, which I think is nice, but it's kind of where it falls short. Both the fight in the mines and the final fight with Krauser are awesome, and honestly some of my favorite bosses of all time. So to get a human boss similar is nice. The problem is that just like that fight, it's super short, and even with the extra phase, it's a bit underwhelming. I do enjoy how parry-centric this fight is. but it's still way too easy and short for the character we're going up against. Hunk is literally one of the strongest non-hero human characters in the series, so it does make sense for someone like Leon or hell even Chris to kill him. But the way he goes out makes this feel like too much of a wash. And like Mr. X, everyone just sort of moves on. Although I will say it's nice that it's left somewhat ambiguous, as Leon didn't check the body or anything, so he could still be alive. Even then, this fight is good, but not as good as it could be. Then we get to the final boss later on, and oh man, this one's probably the weirdest. I don't even know if I should consider Gideon and his second phase as different fights or not, because they feel so different. I mean, obviously the human phase is different from the blob phase, but my point is that there's such a significant quality drop from phase 1 to 2 because they're such completely different feeling encounters. The human phase is pretty fun, although I wish there was a bit more to expand upon his moveset. It reminds me somewhat of the Krauser final fight in 4, at least the last phase of it, but if it encouraged you to use more guns than melee. He honestly had so much potential to be the best fight in the game. However, then he does the usual RE final boss thing of becoming an amalgamative blob, and then this part is a lot less interesting. He's similar to Blob Nemesis from RE3 Remake, which makes sense because he is a nemesis, but not nearly as annoying because you don't have to power a railgun or whatever this time. You just pop pinballs like other bosses in this series, which is fine, but that's kind of all you do while avoiding tentacles. He's sort of boring. I think the final blow with the Requiem pistol is nice, but the fight itself is just kind of okay. I think my issue with the bosses comes down to two things: how underwhelming most of them are, and their relation to the dual campaign system. Obviously, I've already mentioned how a lot of the fights are either really easy or too short when played normally. Mr. X and Hunk are obvious examples of this, which sucks considering that these are fan favorite characters that I wish had better fights. Of course, don't draw out the fight, but there obviously should have been more, and it should have been way harder on normal difficulty, or at least just a little bit. The other issue is a lot deeper, because this game hinges on its balance between playing as the two characters. Well, I did say earlier that it makes sense that Grace only has one actual boss, and it's more believable to some degree. This also is a video game. Leon having more bosses makes more sense, but a lot of these segments you kind of forget about Grace as a whole. Even in the Chunk fight where you can kill Chunk as Grace if you inject him enough times, that's just a different version of Chunk. However, one part I did like about that fight is how insurmountable it seems as Grace, only for Leon to take it out with ease. It's hard to really describe a fix to this issue where Leon gets most of the bosses, but maybe more stuff like hiding from the bosses as Graves more often, or stunning and maneuvering around them before Leon deals with it could work. I mean, if you think about it, that's basically how it was in other games when you avoided the stalkers versus when you had to fight them later. Except here it would make a lot more sense because you're running away from them as a weaker character, only to defeat them as a stronger one. Hell, this would actually be consistent with Grace's fight with the girl, since that one's a lot less about shooting the stalker until the next phase, and more so about you running away from the girl while trying to open a hatch so she can eventually die. Meaning she doesn't just hit the weak spots or shoot her until she dies. I think generally, while there were shortcomings with the dual campaign, I still like how the game handles it. We get just the right amount of both characters without either feeling like they take too long. Besides some awkward and scripted moments here and there that are mostly infrequent, I think this game is almost perfectly paced and balanced. Almost. It still has its snafus here and there. I feel like when I first started writing this script, it felt like the game had a borderline perfect dual campaign, but after thinking about it more and more, I realized it's still very imperfect. But that doesn't mean that it's not at least still good and probably the best use of it in this entire series. Whether you play as Grace or Leon, I doubt your preference will really outweigh the other so hard that you'll hate one or the other. Unless you're a newer RE fan that's only played 8 and 4 Remake and hates Grace because her segments are too slow, which in that case, your opinion is invalid. I would say I personally prefer to play as Leon, but that's because I enjoy a lot of action RE games quite a bit besides 6. However, Grace's gameplay had a lot more depth overall, yet I wouldn't say I staunchly prefer one to the other. I know saying everyone's a winner sounds like a shitty cop-out analysis, but you can't tell me I'm wrong unless you prove otherwise. Requiem is my favorite game of 2026 so far, although that may change eventually since I have other games I've been meaning to play and review this year, so we shall see, including other Capcom games. And honestly, I'm kinda proud of Capcom, so whether they make RE10 or some original thing, I just wish the best. I usually end my videos with some semi-poignant final line that encapsulates how I feel about the game or what I want in the future. However, I do want to address some things that nobody cares about, so click off if you don't care. I know I haven't been uploading too much because of other things to do, like college and whatnot, and I also just get caught up in other stuff. I mean, remember, this is a channel where I review media, so I obviously don't watch movies or anime or play games or whatever else just for videos. A reminder that YouTube is mostly just a hobby for me. especially since I have a very low sub count, which, you guys can help out by subscribing and whatnot. That'd be nice. Even if I do like being rewarded for my effort with viewership and positive buzz. I am passionate about this stuff, but it's not going to be the only thing I ever do until the day I die or anything. With that said, I still have a lot of plans for videos this year. As of writing, I finished the new LEGO Batman game last week, so expect a video probably before July, maybe around it. I don't know. I really have a lot to say about it, and it'll fill the unspoken quota of reviewing 2 new games a year. Although speaking of new games, I do kind of want to change my approach when talking about new games on this channel. Instead of just reviewing 2 or 3 and then ignoring everything else, I want to take the best attributes from games that I do and don't like, and talk about certain things and make videos on them. I may mostly make boss rankings out of these, as those have been pretty fun for me to make recently, and I'm glad that the 2 videos have been doing moderately successfully on this channel, so expect more of those. I'll likely do that for Phantom Blade Zero whenever that comes out, if I'm playing the game, so stay tuned. Besides that, after the LEGO Batman video, I'll likely finish the failed anime adaptations video before my birthday in August. I'm about 4/5 through the pre-production part, and about 3/5 through the script writing, so I may be done even sooner than that. But alas, more videos will be coming, and I'm fairly active online, so do follow me on Letterboxd, my anime list, or Backlogged if you want to see opinions on stuff that you probably care about. I don't think my opinions are too controversial, but that could just be me thinking that. Anyway, I'm going back to sleep.